Ahoy, you salty sailors. Time to raise anchor and set sail for your best scrawny life. Arr!
Ladies and gentlemen, we are back, fly fishing and paddling the glorious rivers of the North American mid-continent rift. After all those days and nights in the hospital, all the pain, all the fear and misgiving, after all the thunder and rain, and against all the odds, somehow I made it back for another season of river fishing. Let me walk that back a step. I shouldn't say somehow, because I very much know how I got here. I had a lot of encouragement and help from my family members, neighbors, friends, and coworkers. And of course, the tireless efforts of the doctors, the nurse practitioners, the rehab therapists, all the radiology staff who had to stop what they were doing and lift me kicking and screaming from the hospital bed onto the machine and back again. There was that transporter who inspired me to walk the first few steps from the hospital bed in the hall to the one in my room. Even the insurance company has been great. They allowed me to go to the Mercy Rehab Hospital. Everything the doctors have asked for, they have paid up. And all I've ever had was the most basic Blue Access plan from Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And now I'm soaking up that summer sunshine on a deep green bend pool with a sparkling riffle above and below it, and a big smallmouth living right in the middle. In Iowa, it really doesn't get any better than that. But most of all, the reason I get to enjoy this now is because of the nurses who cared for me and put up with me. If you get the privilege of spending some time around a bunch of nurses, you won't be impressed with celebrities or politicians afterward. Now, you might ask, Uncle Scrawny, the only reason I would ever spend time around a bunch of nurses is if something bad happened to me and I were hospitalized, and you're calling that a privilege? I'm saying there's more than one way to look at things. And I came away from the experience with a much higher opinion of nurses and a significantly more humble opinion of myself. I was at risk for paralysis, and how close I actually came I'm not entirely sure, but the fear of it certainly weighed on me, and that had to be overcome just like spinal fractures and everything else. So every bit of encouragement helped. I guess you could say it's a lot like running the rapids. Things start happening quickly, and there's only time to focus on what you need to do moment by moment. And so before you know it, what seemed impossible or what seemed too difficult is already done and behind you. You can't control the river, but at the same time, circumstances do not need to overwhelm you. I had to push the worries aside and just focus on moment by moment doing what I needed to do as best I could. I had dedicated, self-sacrificial people working long hours, doing everything they could to help me. So I trusted them and did as much as I could to help the people who were helping me. And surely enough, before I knew it, the nurses had carried me through the rapids. And just look where I am now. Now, the health of the fish populations in the rivers of the Mississippi drainage, in particular, where they drain through the North American mid-continent rift zone, there are some things to be concerned about after the drought of the last several years. Just look, though, at this amazing, gorgeous smallmouth. Look at that fish. Thanks, everybody. I could not have done it without you. But I do have some concerns about the smallmouth population in the South Skunk and the Middle Raccoon rivers. Elsewhere, there are a lot of little smallmouth. The larger specimens are few and far between, but I think that has a lot to do with how far they had to travel to find wintering pools last fall, and where the river level was when the spring spawning runs came around. Sucker populations may have an effect on that too, though, and it seemed like there were fewer red horse suckers. Of course, the white suckers are gone from those rivers. I documented the die-offs of the white sucker populations in many of those rivers in the early 2000s during the heat waves we had then. But I did see a lot of northern hog suckers and river carp suckers, which are food for large bass and pike. A possible silver lining is that there didn't seem to be nearly as many carp in most of these places as I expected to see. So maybe, just maybe, the invasive species have taken one on the chin instead of always gaining ground at the expense of the native species. Although if you have 2 carp, the next year you have 1,000,000. So it's hard to say what the lasting impact will be. If the native suckers return to these areas and their population builds faster than that of the carp, they may become predators of carp eggs and help to control them in that way. Smallmouth buffalo, too, which compete directly with carp, seem to be rebounding in some of these areas. There was a significant hatch of white mayflies on the middle raccoon, which was encouraging to see. It suggested that the base of the food web is still largely intact, although the summer caddis flies, I didn't see any of those there, and that was somewhat worrying. But I mean, I didn't start flipping over rocks or doing any kind of a scientific count or anything. And weather conditions and things like that also play a role in when they hatch and how they behave and so forth. So I don't think we can draw any certain conclusions from that. But elsewhere, it did seem like caddis numbers were down as well. I did turn over a few rocks, and I suspect that the numbers of net making or web making caddis flies are down, as well as possibly a decline in brachyphyllid species, and possibly even a decline in crayfish. I didn't see very many of them when I flipped some rocks over, which is to be expected. If the crayfish, of course, can't migrate to wintering pools over long distances the way a fish can, and if they're in a pool or a place and the water at that time is so shallow that it freezes when winter comes, that it freezes entirely, then no surprise that you're going to lose a significant number of crayfish there. But overall, I'm not concerned about the base of the food web on any of these rivers. I think it will bounce back pretty quickly. As you'll recall from one of my videos in the spring, there are still good numbers of midges and stoneflies hatching in the Middle Raccoon River. Yes, sir. Finally got a decent smallmouth jump on camera. Going back to the subject of crayfish, it is a break in the food web. I mean, the insect larvae, of course, some are predatory, but for the most part, they're eating algae, and minnows are also eating algae. So that's one pathway from algae to minnow to bass, but the other pathway from algae to insect larvae to crayfish to bass, it could represent a break in that food web. Now the link from algae to insect larvae to sucker to large bass and pike and so forth, I think is still strong in all but a couple of the rivers. So population dynamics is complicated as always. I think that there were a lot of little smallmouth, and I think they're eating something, obviously. So I think if they can't find crayfish, they'll just eat more minnows. And there were definitely lots of minnows in all these places. And maybe that's playing in favor of the smallmouth bass because a carp could prey on a crayfish, so bass and carp compete for crayfish. But a carp does not necessarily prey on minnows, or not very often. So that sort of a shift may favor smallmouth bass over carp. Although I think if there was actually an impact to the carp population during the drought, it probably happened over the winters. Maybe they just didn't have the instinct to migrate out of some of the places that froze. In any case, I think that moving forward, I will probably kill and cut open and then return to the river any carp that I catch, which will provide food for crayfish, and just play whatever limited role that I can in helping to rebuild that link in the food web.
Alright, we've got some decent hedgehogs here. You can see these little teeth or denticles on the underside of the cap. Has that odd brown color. Little patch right there. We got a few back in here. There's a couple more decent hedgehogs. Not much bug damage.
The term hedgehog refers to several very similar looking species in the genus Hydnum. In this case, Hydnum rufescens. These are good edible mushrooms that are fairly easy to identify due to the denticles or teeth or spines that form the fertile surface on the underside of the mushroom, as opposed to radial gills or pores, as we've seen on the underside of some other species of mushrooms. These are mycorrhizal fungi that associate with oak and hickories, and therefore emerge from the ground in forest areas containing those species of trees. Before cooking these mushrooms, I generally scrape the spines away so they don't make a mess, and they do taste a little bit and faintly like hickory nuts. They are most common in late summer, as there are fewer chanterelles. The hedgehogs sort of fill that gap. Now, the taxonomy of these has gotten somewhat more complicated in recent years. We'll call these ones Hydnum rufescens for the time being, although maybe that should be understood as sort of a blanket term. They're certainly a little darker in color than would be found with Hydnum repandum. You might notice as well the lobe-forming tendencies around the margins of the cap. Now, jumping from the Hydnaceae to the Boletaceae, this, I believe, is one of the toxic boletes. In any case, the species name Inedulus serves as a warning against eating it.
Alright, it does immediately stain blue. I think that could be Caloboletus inedulus.
Note the brown color of the cap, but the yellow color of the pore layer, and of course the blue staining as well. Now, this is the paved trail that runs between Ivan's campground and the Red Rock tailwaters on the southwest side of the river. There's a steep hillside with false Solomon seal, but more interestingly, Aurelia racemosa, American spikenard, which is a somewhat rare plant, and so this is a well-known and easy-to-access location. Now, there are only 5 or 6 plants along this trail, so I expect anyone who's using this information to respect the rarity of these plants. I've got some maidenhair ferns as well.
But yeah, someone wanting to study these plants or collect seeds to try to grow them themselves could find them along the trail that runs between Ivan's campground and the Tailwaters area. So that's it for this episode. Take care, and we'll see you next time.